Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Teacher Development Webinars. My name is Amanullah Sand. I facilitate virtual programs at Teacher Development Webinars. Teacher Development Webinars is a social action project to support teachers and educators around the world with professional development opportunities. It is an initiative using the rise in online professional development to connect people from around the world with opportunities which they may not have had due to the old normal of face-to-face conferences. We are thankful to Master English Training for sponsoring a Zoom account. And now it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce Dr. Andy Gao. Dr. Zusong Andy Gao is a language teacher, educator at the School of Education, University of New South Wales, Australia. He has been involved in a language teacher education in Hong Kong, mainland China, and Taiwan. His research interests include language learner autonomy, language education policy, and language teacher education. We are happy to have you at Teacher Development Webinars. Dr. Andy, welcome to Teacher Development Webinars.
Thank you, Amnullah, for the warm invitation. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to share my work with you. So shall I share my screen?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. Topic today is called Language Teacher Agency. This is based on a publication I co-authored with Dr. Jane Tao at the Shanghai University of Economic Finance. We published this Cambridge Elements title in language teaching on Language Teacher Agency. So if you're interested in learning more about what I will be talking about today, you can visit the web link and trying to see whether you can see, read or access this publication. So what I'm going to do is I'll be talking about what is Language Teacher Agency. I will be also talking about what does Language Teacher Agency, or why does Language Teacher Agency matter? How does it work? And most importantly, how can we promote a teacher agency? If I have time, I will be talking about a trans perspective on language teacher agency, which brings different perspective understanding together and trying to understand the role of language teacher agency in our professional development. So why do I have to talk about language teacher agency or teacher agency? Because the world we are experiencing, or the world ahead of us, is of course full of uncertainty, exacerbated by the pandemic, but also ongoing structural issues and political issues, or even social cultural issues that create that help us, well, basically make the world full of uncertainty. And of course, we are dealing with very complex world, also very complex professional condition. And teachers or language teachers are asked to work in highly challenging situations, and not only because of the pandemic, but also because of this change in the world that make teaching such a complex, challenging task. That's why we are looking for the resource within us, and so we can find out some sort of solutions from ourselves. And that's here's a list of things that language teachers or many teachers may have to cope with in our professional practice or experience. And for instance, we're talking about dramatic social cultural changes brought by, well, it could be by something positive like technological development. Well, then for this reason, we can introduce new ways of teaching, but new ways of living our life, but then creates new challenges in education as well. And then we need to cope with shifting educational policies and curriculum, because we are having social cultural changes. Education Education and practice need to respond to these social cultural changes. As a result, different governments in different parts of the world have been introducing new policies, new curricula, so that we can enable our younger generations to be fully prepared for the new world. And as a result, many teachers will go through, a lot of changes, and the change could be quite challenging and involve a lot of emotional labors. For instance, you might have to deal with risk associated with professional practice. For instance, because of the social cultural changes, there's certain things we used to do, but we cannot do before our students, or it's the things we used to say before our students, we cannot say because of a certain risk associated with particular behavior or particular viewpoints, especially when we're dealing with very controversial, sensitive issues in classroom teaching. And there are definitely a lot of challenges for us to cope with in order to learn to adapt and respond to numerous shifts, changes, or emergent situations or emergent complexities in our teaching practice. As a result, the kind of resources within us that we are looking for make us to value the role of agency in language teachers' professional development, because we need to change, we needed to learn new things to adapt to the new emergent, increasingly complex, challenging teaching situations. We also need to understand, better understand why teacher agency matters and how it works. If we want to help language teachers or teachers to respond to these challenges in a better way. That's why we need to recognize teachers or language teachers. We are reflective and reflexive agents. We are thinking about what is happening in the world. We also looking into ourselves and looking for responses and solutions within ourselves in order for us to cope with the kind of changing conditions outside of practice. When we talk about agency, we need to talk about a lot of sort of conflating terms that can be easily conflating with the notion of agency. For instance, one of the most popular one will be autonomy, because I think if you have read my work, you probably know that I've done a lot of work on learner autonomy as well. So I'm now talking about agency. So what's the difference between agency and autonomy? According to Benson, autonomy is a capacity to exercise control over their lives or learning or teaching practice. Autonomy, well, arguably, is more focused on individuals, though interdependence, of course, has been increasingly mentioned as an important aspect of autonomy as well. But it's pretty much about language learning teachers, language learners and teachers taking initiatives, managing, control their own learning and teaching. Agency is not just a natural property of individuals, but although it can be also recognized or regarded as a social culturally mediated capacity to act. Now, if you compare with this probably the famous, mostly frequently used definition of agency, you can see a lot of overlap between autonomy and agency here, because both of them refer to the kind of capacity. The difference is, of course, according to Aachen, agency is a social culturally mediated capacity, while autonomy is a capacity to exercise control of their lives. So the difference will be related to the social culturally mediated. We know agency has a very different kind of a disciplinary background, because agency is often discussed in relation to structure. Well, we can arguably say autonomy as a form of agency or a phenomenon associated with agency. So you can see that these people are trying to regard agency as the root of autonomy, or as something underlying the autonomy, and agency as a capacity to initiate a purpose of action that implies the will, autonomy, freedom, and choice. Clearly, these colleagues are saying agency is the root, while autonomy is kind of a outcome or product of agency. We also hear colleagues arguing agency occurs through interactive positioning. Remember Ahern's definition of social culturally mediated, that to do with the kind of interaction or interactive positioning, and hence agency is often relational and shared. And some people, of course, being arguing autonomy will have the similar kind of features. And agency is also to do with identity negotiation. If you remember, or if you have read Benson's famous kind of a argument that relates agency, identity, and autonomy, he suggests that agency is the rule starting point, while autonomy is the process, while identity is the outcome, kind of thing. It's very important for us to be careful when we talk about what agency is, because I think when I talk about agency as a social culturally mediated capacity, I've already somehow taken a position. And it's important for us to remember there's not a universally agreed upon definition of agency. So that's why sometimes agencies can be can have a lot more to do with autonomy. Other times that they can be quite different from autonomy. By offering a definition of agency, I have already sort of presupposed or taking a particular kind of a theoretical position. And that's why we argue in our publication at the Cambridge University Elements in Language Teaching, we argue the need for trans-perspective because we want to bring different perspectives together to enrich our understanding of agency in language education, especially in relation to language teachers' professional development, because that's so important for us. We need to constantly develop ourselves in response to the changing context and increasingly complex, challenging situation. There are other related concepts, for instance, already mentioned identity. Other concepts will be knowledge, emotion. I think when I elaborate the definition of different definition of agency in different perspectives, I will refer to some of the key relevant concepts later. As I said, there are different ways of defining agency, or I will try to elaborate 4 major approaches to conceptualizing teacher agency. And the first is social cognitive theory, agency as an intentional act that seems to favor this kind of definition. The second approach is called social cultural theory. That's to do with agency as a social culturally mediated capacity. This is probably the most popular or most well-known, most frequently used definition of agency in applied linguistics or in language education research. And then we can have this so-called post-structuralist view, which views agency as a discursive practice. The last one is called ecological perspective. That's the one I have been using in my own research in related to language teacher agency. And we like to see agency as a phenomenon, as something happening, or something being done, or something, well, somebody, language teacher is doing something. So what is language teacher agency according to social cognitive theory? As I said earlier, the social cognitive theory will conceptualize agency as an intentional act. That sounds very similar to autonomy sometimes. Well, the theory talks about a human agency as embedded in a self-theory encompassing self-organizing, proactive, self-reflective, self-regulative mechanism. So it's a lot to do with the self-individual. So that, in this sense, and it's very similar to the kind of cognitive approach to conceptualizing autonomy as well. And the key is the belief system, which is kind of foundation of human agency. They need, well, he basically is belief, and and then associated with belief is knowledge. These concepts are central when we talk about human agency or agency. When we adopt this kind of theory in doing research, the kind of guiding question will be, how does teacher's self-efficacy influence his or her excess of agency? So it's always to do with self-efficacy, belief, and then agency, exercise of agency. And the key related concepts will be, as I said earlier, belief and knowledge and self-efficacy. This is the kind of a very brief overview of social cognitive theory. Obviously, if you know about self-efficacy and cognitive theory, social cognitive theory, you will know that Bandura is the leading person in this field. And a second approach, as I said earlier, is probably the most widely used, and probably most popular, most famous conceptualization of agency. This is social cultural theory, which conceptualizes agency as a social culturally mediated capacity. And so the most important thing is, it's not the social cultural theory colleagues will argue that it's not to do with kind of individual process. It's to do with kind of a socially distributed cognition as a result of the kind of a agency that could be attributed to the group rather than individual. So the importance of group rather than individual, it's socially distributed cognition. And it's very important for people to be aware of when the social cultural theory people talking about agency, it's an agent, the kind of person who's seen as having agency, is viewed as being an irreducible aggregate of individuals together with mediational means, or individuals with in intermental functioning. Intermental means you have two people or more than two people, they're working together and they thinking together, the kind of a somehow there's some sort of interaction between the individuals involved in the process. And individual with mediation means that could somehow participate in this kind of a socially interactive process. The kind of guiding question for this kind of inquiry will be, how is teachers' agencies mediated by the contextual condition? For instance, they will be talking about often new policy mandates or new curriculum. We have introduced a new curriculum. How does that impact or mediate teachers' agency? And the key related concepts will be intermental functioning, as we know that we need to focus on not on individual brains, but two or three or more brains working together, connected together with mediation tools or means. Well, these if you're interested in learning more about this social cultural theory, of course, you can read Ahan's work, but you can also read this publication. And the third perspective or third approach is called post-structuralist view, which views agency as a discursive practice. It emphasizes agency may be discursively constructed as a positioning made available to some, but not to others. Certain people with this kind of discursively constructed position, they can talk about certain things, they can do some things, while others, where they're being discursively constructed in different ways, they may not be able to do or talk about the same thing as the other people be allowed to do by their positioning. So it's an understanding of each in person is one who has an obligation to take themselves up as a knowable, recognizable identity who speaks for themselves. So you need to be positioned in place in particular ways. You are positioned as a knowable and recognizable identity, and you will be speaking for yourselves and accept responsibility for your actions. If you are somehow positioned as someone who are not responsible for certain things, for instance, teachers in relation to curriculum reform or renewal or education reform, if they're now positioned as someone who can participate as authors or key stakeholders in education reforms, then they don't have to be bothered with this sort of education, the consequences of, for instance, bad education reforms, for instance. So that's to do with the kind of a post-structuralist view. And the guiding questions, if you adopt post-structural views, will be how does teacher agency interact with positioning in the social context? Think about how often language teachers are positioned in particular ways, in particular context, and that kind of positioning will enable them or somehow constrain them from doing some things. And that the key related concepts will be like positioning, which is very important, and knowledge, and in relation to their exercise of agency. The fourth major approach to conceptualizing agency, there's one we favor in our research, is the ecological perspective, which views agency as a phenomenon and doing. It's very important because we have this doing, which means agency has a temporal and also situated achievement. We recognize that people does something, it's an achievement situated in particular context at a particular time. So that means if we want to understand agency in different contexts and time, we need to focus on the dynamic interplay between, for instance, language teachers' past influences, experiences, and their engagement with the present, and of course, the orientation towards the future. So we have to look at past, present, and future together. And teacher agencies always exercise for certain purposes, and I shall elaborate what these purposes can be. Within certain historically formed time, social, cultural, material circumstance, you needed, conditions, contextual conditions, and it is always constrained at the same time by this circumstance. So we need to look at what this circumstance can be constraining, but this circumstance can be also facilitating particular kind of a exercise or particular kind of doing. That means that there's an indicator of teachers' agency. So, and the guiding question for studies that adopt ecological perspectives will be how its agency is achieved, and the key related concepts will be identity, for instance, emotion or belief. The belief and knowledge seems to be quite important, and identity, emotion seem to be quite important key related concepts when we talk about agency. I already talked about the kind of purposes that teachers can have when they exercise agency. Now, there could be many purposes they have when they trying to do something, but I want to relate to teacher or language teachers' professional development. We believe teacher agency plays a critical role in facilitating teachers' professional development. And because of teacher agency plays a critical role in facilitating teachers' professional development, this means teacher agency also plays a critical role in sustaining desired education change. If we want to have positive education changes, we need teachers who will be adapting themselves to sustain the kind of desired educational change. If all these things come together, then we shall have improved students' learning, or students improve their learning. So teacher agency also plays a critical role in improving students' learning. And I said earlier that agency can be exercised by teachers for different purposes. And we want to highlight these purposes. For instance, pedagogical purpose, moral purposes, and change purposes. I'll explain this purpose a bit more with this figure. For instance, teacher agency plays a very important role in continuously, well, for teachers, continuously learning to teach, and a teacher agency could, play a critical role in policy implementation, and teacher agency also play a critical role in addressing some of the social issues for us to achieve social justice. And there's a time element, as I said earlier. Time is very important because it's a temporal and situated achievement. So teacher agency is something that will matter for a long time for our continuing professional development. And I shall elaborate these purposes and to answer the question why teacher agency matter or language teacher agency matter. Well, at the individual level, teacher agency is very important for us to learn when we try and learn to teach. For instance, if we are, basically we have to be aware of the kind of variety of challenges language teachers in different career stages have to respond to in learning to teach or professional development. For instance, when we talk about student teachers or early career teachers, for instance, they need to somehow achieve high quality peer relationship because this peer relationship or peer relations matter a lot to their sense of professional agency, and they want to achieve a good student-teacher relationship in teaching. For in-service teachers, experienced teachers, we often have to deal with the kind of experiences like the one mentioned on the screen. Education reforms often make us feel de-skilled because the things we used to do is no longer valued by the introduction of new pedagogical approach. So we sometimes feel threatened. So after feeling de-skilled, and then we also have to deal with the rising regime of accountability and introduction of external standards on basically we are being constantly evaluated by external standards in terms of our teaching practice. And so it's not really simple to say, well, we love teaching, we love to make our students feel happy in the learning process, and as a result, they can learn better. It's we have to cope with a lot of accountability issues. For instance, we have to fill a lot of forms, we have to do a lot of reporting, we have to tell our superiors or principals what we have been doing all the time. And it's very important. We need to talk about relational agency or collective agency later, if I have time. At the institutional national level, a teacher agency plays a critical role in ensuring positive education change will be achieved, because teachers are key to implementing curriculum reforms or educational policies. We are change agents. If we positioned as change agents, we are valued as change agents, we will play a critical role in ensuring education policies will be implemented successfully. But often when we have education reforms, we may experience conflicts between our value system and the values promoted by educational change. So we can, or we may, contest the change implicitly, passively. We don't have to make our dissent known to the policymakers, but if we don't like the policy, there's really no way for someone at the top to ensure the policy will be implemented successfully, because we can contest the change implicitly, unknowingly, passively. So that's why education reforms needs to ensure that teachers feel that they retain control of the professional practice. They value us and value our agency in implementing education reforms. And often, of course, this is not possible for a lot of education reforms. That's why I think partly And that's why a lot of education reforms do not necessarily lead to the kind of desired outcomes. At a society level, teacher agency plays a very important role in advocating social justice. I think that's why I think this is a very important venue, because teacher development seminars have been developed to address these issues as well. We do not just pass on knowledge to students, we prepare them to function and make positive impacts in their roles in society. So we not just pass on knowledge to our students. And for this reason, we need to be aware of the social, cultural, economic condition of those who are frequently marginalized and socially excluded. We need to act for them. If this is not possible, I mean, it's of course, it's ideal. We can agentively find ways to promote social justice in our teaching, but if it's not possible for us to do something bigger, but at least we can engage these issues in our teaching, especially when we engage with controversial but crucial issues like gender, race in teaching. And it's very important for teachers to be reflexive. Reflexivity is a central element of agency. We need to think about our own values, whether we have bias or assumptions that need to be a little bit questioning, or we need to reflect on what we ask it to do by schools or the society, to see whether what we ask it to do needs a little bit more questioning. That kind of process, this process is going to be a lifelong process. So that's why we need to talk about chronological aspects of teacher agency. It will be in a very important part of our ongoing professional development. Our learning never stops. Even when we retire, we need somehow to have this agency operating throughout our professional trajectory. Well, we know that teacher agency is kind of a temporary constructive, but it's also it's going to last throughout our entire professional trajectory. This is just example from one of the study conducted by the first author of the Cambridge University Elements in Language Teaching publication, Tao. She conducted an ethnographic study in Chinese University, where you have a English teacher who used to teach English for general purpose, but she somehow was asked to teach a forensic English course. So in order to teach this course well, she decided to take a 2-year master course in law. And not only she took the course, so she also got herself involved in, say, teaching development projects, developing teaching materials, introducing new resources in teaching. And anyway, the conclusion is exercise agency is continuous. She's constantly responding to issues at different levels in different ways in an ongoing manner. Two more studies to illustrate the manifestations of teacher agency. For instance, Buchanan, 2015, talks about the mismatch or match between teachers and schools' understanding of what it means to be a professional and impact on this mismatch or match on the exercise teacher agency. For instance, it's quite understandable when teachers trying to decide what it means to be professional. We draw on our own experiences. Wonderful teachers we met. Schools instead will be looking at macro level discourses related to accountability and standardization rather than the kind of individual encounter with wonderful teachers. So you have inevitably, you may have this match, we have a mismatch, or you may have match as well between the two value system. So then you have two types of agency. One is called stepping up, the other is called pushing back. Stepping up is happens when teachers' value system match the kind of values promoted by schools or macro level discourses. And when teachers feel that their values match that kind of policy discourse school, they will go above and beyond the perceived expectations of their roles. That's very important, significant, because if teachers feel that their values are in harmony with what is being promoted, they will do more to ensure success will be achieved. If somehow teachers' value systems are in sort of a contradiction, or they don't go along well with the kind of school value system, or then teachers will have display some sort of resistance. They will reject, they will negotiate, or even reconfigure the perceived expectation of roles imposed upon them by school. So it's an important message for policymakers. If you want a great success, you need to really ensure that majority of teachers, their views are somehow respected and somehow echoed in your policy discourse. Another study, similar kind of finding, when you have somehow, teachers will basically exam, even they're not allowed or they're not invited to participate in the policy development. The teachers will exam and they will identify areas of the policy that match their beliefs, and then they will take ownership of the policy. If they identify that this policy and their beliefs somehow are similar to each other, and they will take ownership of the policy. And this will, of course, ensure the successful implementation of the policy. But somehow the policy doesn't go well with what teachers believing, then teachers will reframe it and adapt it in practice. Of course, they will do this by after consulting a variety of trusted sources like colleagues or even books, or even their lecturers. They will ask you your opinions about particular practice. And as a result, teachers are not only just policy implementer, they are also policy author, because they can adapt, they can reframe the policy in practice. If you want to ensure a policy to be successfully implemented, you need to recognize that important fact or reality. So why language teacher agency? Well, we talk about the importance of teacher agency, and we can also talk about a long list of why language teacher as agency matters. For instance, we need to talk about language teachers working with students with diverse social linguistic backgrounds. Some of them are marginalized social culturally or social linguistically. Others may have different kind of roles or influence in the society. But often we somehow have limited knowledge, understanding of these students, so we need to learn. Or when we talk about non-native speaker teachers, we need to somehow exercise agency in navigating this native speakerism ideology which dominates in their profession. Whether you like it or not, we need somehow show that we are competent professionals. So, but even when we talk about native speaker teachers, they also need to exercise agency in dealing with potential marginality in studies conducted in places like Hong Kong and Japan. Although they seem to be valued, but then they also somehow cut off from the schools teachers community because they are the kind of the possession of valued guest status. But I mean, that means that they potentially marginalized in the school community as well. Language teachers often face new demands in the context of shifting curriculum. Pedagogy, for instance, in some contexts, they ask it to adopt new practice imported from other contexts. In many, for instance, in China or in other contexts, the language teachers ask it to adopt task-based language teaching or community language teaching, which may go well or may not go well with the reality they have to respond to in teaching. Also, language teachers may exercise agency in making career transitions due to language policy change in some contexts. For instance, in Vietnam or in China some years ago, where they used to teach Russian in universities, but then all of a sudden they were asked to teach English, as if Russian and English are same language. So you need to somehow adapt to this kind of change, which is quite dramatic. And they also need to somehow resist certain language-related ideology, that's in teaching where, for instance, in many contexts, language teachers ask it to use English only in teaching, where the student's first language could be useful resources for learning and teaching. They could be used quite strategically to help students overcome certain learning difficulties, but somehow teachers ask it to use English only. And in many contexts, language teachers in universities are pressured to publish in English in many contexts, regardless of the language they teach. So if you teach German, teach French, teach Japanese in Chinese university, or in Vietnamese university, because you want a promotion, you need to publish in certain journals, and certain journals usually are English medium journals. So you have to publish your work in English, even though you teach and you speak and you learned German or French, not English. And the list can go on. So that's why it's important for us to talk about promoting teacher agency. There are a variety of things we can do, but we summarize two important actions or strategies we could do. The first is to do with the contextual condition. The second is to do with individual teachers promoting the actor's growth. So let me just sort of elaborate what can we do to change the contextual conditions. We can build teacher communities. I think these teacher development seminars seems to be a very important instrument in promoting teacher community. Teacher communities could be of varying size, could be 2 or 3, or a large international global community like this one. It's very important for us to have a safe and socially supportive space for teachers to exercise agency. And we need to promote this kind of community bottom up, because top down has certain downsides. When we have this kind of safe place, we can then do things like giving advice, seeking input, asking questions, even sharing concerns or doubts. And that's extremely difficult because a lot of people are afraid of sharing concerns or doubts with other people. Then gradually we can change the structural conditions for education and policy making and implementation. Through this kind of bottom-up process, we are forming groups and forming communities, and gradually we can influence educational policy making, hopefully. And when we are involved in education policy making, we will play a very important role in the policy's actual implementation. And we need to ensure that the teachers' communities or groups have the following characteristics. And these groups and communities need to be relevant to teachers' work. It's not just a place for us to moan or complain. It's a place that to work out some professional issues. The communities and groups need to be collaborative in nature, and they need to work for the benefit of all, not just for ourselves, kind of aggrandizement. Teachers need to trust and remain open to each other, because otherwise it won't be a safe place and socially supportive spaces. It won't be a socially supportive space for us to share our concerns. And these kind of places or spaces won't be a natural or social given. That means we need to work together and to make it happen. To work together in a bottom process to form these communities and groups. The second is to do with actors' growth. First, that's very important. We need to overcome deficit discourses related to language teachers and learners, negative positioning of non-native speakers in the profession, for instance. And remember the post-structuralist view, agency is to do with kind of positioning. So if we position ourselves in a very negative way, of course, we constrain ourselves in terms of our exercise of agency. We need to create a reflective space for critical engagement with our own assumptions. And so we can adopt alternative discourses to reposition ourselves and our language learners. So if we set with so many deficit discourse about teaching teachers and language learners, we somehow need to sort of do some sort of critical engagement with these discourses, whether we really believe in these discourses. If we somehow back in mind, we believe in this kind of discourses, so we really need to somehow critically engage with these pre-assumptions and trying to adopt alternative discourses. We can achieve this by, for instance, writing paper for journals or undertaking professional interactions, or we can even share, say, our views, assumptions for critical engagement, collective critical engagement through multimodal narratives. So we can engage, use image or other things to reflect on prior experience and assumptions. Anyway, basically we need somehow create a space or create alternate discourse so we can somehow negotiate for more favorable professional identities to enhance our sense of agency. And that's related to the importance of collective agency. And as I said earlier, teacher agency is highly relational and social. So there's importance of a collective agency where we believe that we cannot produce the desired outcome individually. We need to work together. 1 + 1 is bigger than 2. But it's also important for us to be a bit aware of the situation we find ourselves in. Collective agency is good. They involves collective actions of group of teachers, but there's also a lot of contextual complexity we need to consider. For instance, workplaces may, the complexity of the language teachers of workplaces may undermine collective agency. There's so many rules, standard accountability measures that actually undermine our collective agency. Our boss' famous motto, divide and rule. They don't like us to work together sometimes. And collective power of the team as a whole cannot be realized if language teachers are not connected at the individual or subgroup levels, both emotionally and intellectually. And we can relate to each other quite well intellectually, but sometimes we may find it difficult for us to be relating to each other emotionally as well. So we need to be somehow kind, and we can understand each other's difficult situations a bit more, rather than just engage with intellectual issues, professional issues. Language teachers may not form these kind of connections if a team does not engage in collective activities. So we need to somehow work together. Remember, these groups and communities, they are not social or natural given. It requires us to work together in collective activities to understand each other and to relate to each other emotionally, intellectually, so we can form these kind of groups. So this is the importance of a collective agency. And finally, if I have some, I think don't have time, but basically I want to argue that we need achieve, because agency plays such an important role, we trying to, well, understand how we can promote teacher agency and then understand better how teacher agency operates in our professional practice and professional experience. So that's why we need to adopt what we call a trans perspective towards teacher agency. That's a perspective on teacher agency that cross the boundary, discipline boundary, and not only in terms of the physical sense, but also in the sense of boundary between knowledge and discipline we traditionally inhabit. So we need to, language teachers need to work with, say, math teachers or Chinese well, English language teacher need to work with Chinese language teachers or French language teachers, or language teachers in other contexts need to work with other teachers like chemistry, math, or other, well, whatever subjects you may have in school. So we need to cross the boundary. We need to work together, and we need as researchers, we need to adopt new theories or models, so we can see appreciate the operations or exercise of teacher agency in a different perspective, so we can understand how teacher agency works better. Because with this kind of better understanding, we can then know how we can promote teacher agency better. For instance, in our research, we use ecological perspective, and then we use life history methods, trying to understand language teachers agency across, say, a long time period. In the case of language teachers or language teaching, we need to recognize language teachers are translingual and intercultural practitioners. We constantly cross the border of language, artificial border of language and cultures, sometimes real, sometimes artificial, depends on the position you take. So we need to somehow recognize the relevance of transcultural or intercultural teaching, even recognize the role of translanguaging. So we can say, that's why people argue the importance of using first language or learner's language as strategic learning resources in learning and teaching. Mentioned earlier, we also need to recognize language teachers are teachers in general sense. That means we can draw on what has been done in general teacher education to do with identity, beliefs, emotion, and knowledge, as then use this large body of knowledge to enrich our understanding of language teacher agency in relation to do language teacher identity, belief, motion, knowledge. And sometimes, because we are language teachers are policy authors, so this means we can also draw on theories or research in the field of language policy and planning to inform our understanding of our inquiry into language teacher agency. Okay, I think I'm almost done. This is kind of a what we call trans perspective in language teacher agency research. If you really want to know more about the relevant ideas, please do check out the language teacher agency, the Cambridge University Press, and Elements in Language Teaching, which is, I think, was published mid-October. Okay, if we have time, I can take questions. If we don't, then thank you for your attention. Shall I?
Thank you so very much, Dr. Andy. It was wonderful to listen to you on teacher agency, a topic that we, mostly is neglected in teacher education, and now we are seeing such a rise. So now the floor is open for questions and answers. If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat, and I'll be monitoring the chat. So I saw this question, and it's from Mohammed Tria from Algeria, and he says, how does teacher education help in teaching and learning process? So if you could elaborate on
it. Can I check? Where's the question? Is it in the chat box or in YouTube?
Oh, no, it was submitted earlier in questions.
How is teacher agency related to courses?
Yes, helpful in teaching learning process.
Language teacher agency is to do with our engagements, our presumptions, and so hopefully we can say, for instance, if we feel a lot of teachers feel bad because we are non-native speakers and we don't recognize that, well, so for instance, our strength resources within us. So teacher agency should, well, in a sense, will help us to question these kind of assumptions and recognize the kind of resources we have. Of course, we don't have something, but we do also have something in us that can be very useful in teaching. So by through the kind of agentic kind of a reflexivity, we discover these kind of courses, and we discover the strengths within us. So that will help us teaching. But if you talk about agency in language learning, I had contribute a position paper by Oxford University Press with colleagues like very famous people like Professor Daniel Larson Freeman, Professor Sarah Mercer, and Paul Drive on language learning agency. There's a position paper on that, and we have a lot of list of activities that we think the language teacher can use to enhance learning agency through teaching. If I may, I can post it on the chat box.
Sure, you can. So let me read out some more questions. And Dana Kristrivan, Professor Andy, can you give the example of the agency in the relation with professional development on technology implementation for teaching EFL?
I don't have a specific example, but when new technology introduces language teaching, that means language teachers need to adapt to the new way of teaching because of technology. I think throughout this pandemic, we have seen so many things happening. For instance, teachers were asked to switch teach online all of a sudden without preparation. Then I think we see stories, wonderful stories of how language teachers being adapting themselves with limited prior training, limited resources, to the new condition, new normal. And this is definitely something we can look into. I think system, the journal I quoted at the moment, has special issue on teaching and learning language online. Has well, the special issue has a few papers related to this kind of sudden switch to learning and teaching online. So if you are interested, you can most welcome to check out this system, the journal, Science Direct. You can probably search Google Science Direct and system, you can find the journal, and there's a special issue on teaching and learning language online.
Wonderful. So another question, let me. Yes, Zhuan Hong asked that, could I ask this question, how related are the approaches to agency? Are they complementary or contradictory to some extent?
Different approaches to conceptualizing teacher agency have different strengths. For instance, obviously the first one, social cognitive theory, you can use it, apply it in a large scale survey kind of study, and to find out a large population of teachers, how they feel about their teaching, and others are more kind of looking at how teachers have been doing something, developing their agency or practice. I think the reason why we ask for trans perspective is because we need different perspective to look at different aspects of teacher agency, because the teacher agency, we believe, plays such critical role in sustaining and promoting teachers' professional development, which again plays a critical role in sustaining a successful education reforms that brings or leads to students improved learning outcome. So these are definitely that we could complement each other, but sometimes we may have to use one of them.
So she says that, dear Dr. Andy, I think this question follows my first one. Can I use agency from ecological perspective with the purpose of how agency is achieved, to investigate into learning investment using model of investment, Darwin and Norton, which extends a post-structuralist theories of identity? So she asked if they are compatible.
It's difficult really for me to say right away whether they are compatible or not. First of all, we have to decide what kind of research questions you have and what do you want to achieve. And then, because all these theories or conceptualized into conceptual tools. So once we have the kind of questions, we then look for the kind of a suitable conceptual tools. It's very possible that these two can be working together wonderfully, but you need to sort of explain or justify how they work together.
Wonderful. So I don't see any other questions. And thank you so very much, Professor Andy. It was a wonderful talk, and I really enjoyed it. For coming research scholar, interested in teacher education and professional development. It was really resourceful, and thanks for sharing all these resources. So one of the resources you shared, this book of from Cambridge. So any other resources if you can suggest, if one is interested in this topic of teacher agency.
There's a special issue on language teacher agency in 2018 in the System Journal. So if you're interested, you can definitely go to the System Journal to check out articles in that special issues on language teacher agency. And it's I think it's an important topic. But let's say, well, we are interested in the notion of teacher agency because we need somehow help teachers to overcome significant challenges in their professional development, which is important for sustainable education reforms and improve, which also will play a very important role in helping us to achieve students' improved learning outcomes. So that's why we need to talk about teacher agency and language teacher agency, because it plays a very important role in helping teachers to learn and to develop ourselves for better education outcomes, or better education practice and better education outcomes.
That makes sense. So when I was thinking about, can teacher agency make negative impact on someone's position or class, because when teacher is in power, and then he can use it in a negative terms or positive terms. What are your thoughts on that?
When we're talking about teacher feel empowered, they can it's a potential that they may ask students to do something. I think when teachers feel they're empowered, enabled to do something important, meaningful in helping students to learn better, then if they have this kind of persevering, then they are more likely to do what they believe that they can do. And of course, it's not that simple kind of equation, because you also have to consider the contextual conditions, all sorts of complex factors that somehow mediate the teaching and learning process. But starting, we need to start from teachers and trying to look for some sort of solution first, and then of course it will be somehow, I think it would be hopeful that if more likely that if they believe they can do something, they can do something.
Oh, wonderful. Dr. Andy, any final message or words for teacher development webinar audience?
I know this is a very difficult time. It's a time for us to requires for us to constantly learn and constantly adapt to the new situations. You may say that say, for instance, the current situation, global pandemic, is a crisis, but crisis for many people means challenges, dangers, risks, but they can also mean opportunity for learning. So there's always a positive and negative side of something. Every coin has two sides, as somebody would say. But let's look at the bright side and trying to make best out of the situation. That's how I call the importance of agency here.
Yeah, certainly, this pandemic, I'll see it has been a blessing in disguise for me, especially starting this venture of teacher development webinars, meeting so many, new people who I would have, never dreamed of even. And, this networking, all things. So yeah, you are, 10% right.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Andy. It was wonderful to have you at Teacher Development Webinars today. And for our future webinars, you can always look for future events at www.tdwebinars.org. If you're interested to obtain a certificate for this session, you can email at info.tdwebinars@gmail.com. We are available on Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, and this recording for Dr. Andy's session will also be available at Teacher Development Webinars YouTube channel. So you can rewatch and feel free to share. Thank you so very much to all for your participation. We really appreciate that. Be safe. Bye-bye.
Thank you for your time. Thank you.